today's message. And if you have joined us at all this month, well, I guess if you were here last week, then you caught the beginning of our new series, which is called December Lights. See, it's at this time of the year that many holidays of diverse traditions are celebrated, and these holidays tend to center, as Kathleen mentioned, around the theme of light. And so last week, we looked at Hanukkah and Kwanzaa and how the theme of light permeates through these traditions. And though you may have never celebrated Hanukkah or Kwanzaa, and yet we all came together and we thought about how we might be inspired by the beauty and the wisdom from these traditions, specifically how the December lights of Hanukkah and Kwanzaa invite us to think about rededicating ourselves to our spiritual paths, to our cultural traditions. And so this week, as we look at a new December light, we're going to be looking at something so ancient that in many ways it serves as the foundation of how we celebrate the holidays today. In many ways, it is the undergirding of how we, in the modern day, approach the holidays in December. See, for many of us, the way that we are most familiar with in terms of celebration is Christmas, right? And Christmas is a Christian holiday. And yet, what you might not know is that there are people who consider themselves Christians who do not celebrate Christmas because of where Christmas comes from and what Christmas is built upon. But the idea of being a Christian and not celebrating Christmas almost sounds like moving to Tucson and not eating Mexican food, right? It just doesn't really compute. There's someone out there, right? But it just seems like interesting. But the reason that some people of the Christian faith choose not to celebrate Christmas is because it has what we would consider to be pagan roots, okay? And the idea of pagan roots is something that maybe for some of us in this room, either now or in the past, we might have heard this and had a negative connotation to it. Like, what does this mean? But I think, most of us here at Aldea were like, pagan roots, tell me more. Interesting, right? But I wanted to dispel this word pagan that has had a negative connotation for thousands of years. The word pagan in Latin means country folk, country people. Okay, see in the ancient world, particularly in the Roman Empire, those who lived in larger cities and larger metropolitan areas tended to follow a unified state religion. And so those outside of the cities, those in the countries, tended to participate in ancient earth-based spiritualities that were passed down to them by their ancestors, right? So in other words, this word pagan was used as a way to separate, to say there's us here in the cities and there's them out there, and they have those practices that we don't understand, right? And so if we kind of pull this into a modern context, specifically for those of us who might have grown up in more rigid religion, there were things in those contexts where we would look out and say that people on the outside, right, who participated in alternative spiritualities, even things like yoga or something more connected with the earth, we might have said, oh, that's them, right? And so we can understand how this word pagan is really just a word of division and a word of exclusion. And so when we think about these things that, for many of us, we've now adopted into our spirituality, things that are maybe considered alternative, right? And so we look at something like earth spirituality and an appreciation and connection to one's ancestors through a connection to the earth. And what we find, if we go back in history, is that there is a holiday tradition that is pagan in its roots called Yule. And Yule is an ancient Germanic holiday. Again, that word pagan is an approximation of many different cultures that were outside of the norm, that were outside of the cities, right? And that were participating in ancient ancestral spiritualities. And so Yule was celebrated until about the 4th or 5th century Common Era. Around this time, Christmas, which had also begun to be celebrated, began to sort of co-opt and absorb the traditions of Yule. And we'll get a little bit more into that later, but Yule was essentially an ancient winter festival that took place over 12 days, which is where we get the idea of 12 days of Christmas. And it was based around the solstice. The solstice being a symbol for renewal, for hope. And we can probably even at this point recognize that much of our Christmassy language draws from Yule, right? We've all heard a Christmas song that says the word Yuletide, right? Which essentially just means Yule time of Yule, right? Many of us are familiar with people making Yule puns, right? Which I'm sure you'll love my puns that are to come. Or perhaps you're most familiar with the idea of the Yule log, right? Which we'll get into a little bit more later. But the thing about, the modern day, especially with YouTube, when I think of the Yule log, I think of putting on a loop of, a fireplace. You might have seen it when you came in. You can, nowadays you can just type in Yule log into YouTube and you get smooth Christmas jazz for 10 hours as a fire burns. It's a great replacement if you don't have a fireplace. You can just have it burning on your TV. One of my favorite Yule log videos is actually features the actor Nick Offerman, who you might recognize as Ron Swanson from Parks and Recreation. And this is his Yule log video. He sits quietly with you and drinks a glass of whiskey for 10 hours. It's very soothing. This goes for another 9 hours, 49 minutes, and 30 seconds. I consider just having him join us for the rest of the message, but I don't think so. But anyway, this is an option for you as well as you think about your Yule log. But that is not the Yule log that we're talking about today. We're talking about something that represented light and warmth in the darkest and coldest times of the year. Something we need to remember, as Kathleen reminded us, is that for our ancestors, right, for ancient people, December lights weren't just some decorations, right? It meant survival. The solstice and the return of the sun wasn't just about, what we often feel, which is, we lose a couple of hours of daylight. Maybe that makes me a little more grumpy, right? No, the solstice and the sun was about survival. Or we think about, the lighting, gathering next to the warmth of the fire. Some of us, if we're lucky enough to have a fireplace, we don't even use it, right? Recently I went to someone's house, and every time you see someone's fireplace, you go, the first question you ask is like, do you even use it? And then they go, no, not really, it's too much upkeep, right? For our ancestors, the fire wasn't just some household decoration or some item that we don't even use. The fire was essential. The warmth of the fire was survival, right? And so while some traditions around the holidays focus on a particular story, right? Perhaps like Christmas or like Hanukkah, in many ways, Yule is really about the larger story of nature. It is about the larger cycles of the earth, the grand story that we are all a part of, right? And in this story, what is that human element, the human participation, human struggle of this story? And so as we talk more about Yule and this real ancient way of looking at the holidays, I hope that you don't get the impression that in any way I'm trying to take anything away from Christmas. I can see how it might be a little jarring to understand where we get some of our Christmas traditions. I know for me, I imagine that 10 years ago I might have had a harder time with a message like this. But friends, my intention is actually quite the opposite. It's to say how rich are the traditions that we participate in today, because they draw upon things from thousands of years ago, that we are building upon our ancestors. I'm not here in any way to think of a watering down of Christmas, but actually we're building it up because we're looking at how much we get to experience in line with people who walked this earth long before us, right? That we get to participate in a much larger human story than we ever conceived. Author Dorothy Morrison wrote a book called Yule, a celebration of light and warmth. And she says Yule is the season when we celebrate the rebirth of the sun and the return of light to the earth. It's a time of hope and renewal, reminding us that no matter how dark times may seem, light and warmth will return. How many of us need to hear this on a deep level? So as we think about these themes of hope and renewal, we can also understand how these concepts, symbols, and traditions have found their way into Christmas. See, the prevalence of evergreens and holly, ivy, mistletoe, all of this actually comes from Yule as symbols of life and vitality in the darkness, as symbols of life and hope in the coldness, as symbols of the larger cycle of nature and these things that persist through that cycle. We also get the prevalence of lights in general in many ways from Yule. And we think about the solstice and the power of the solstice. In many ways, the timing of Christmas is built around the solstice, though there is some discussion around why Christmas takes place on December 25th. It's pretty much well agreed upon that that is unrelated to what is estimated to have been the birth of Jesus. It wouldn't have been December 25th. And so it's believed that it has much to do with its proximity to the solstice. Things like caroling and feasting also draw from Yule. Yule was a time of celebration. And Yule is also a time of liminal space, of connecting to one's ancestors. And so when we look at Christmas, and sometimes we see how in many Christmas stories, there's a sense of connection to the other side, things like a Christmas character or a Christmas carol and this connection to spirits. This all comes from Yule. In Susan Pesznecker's book, Yule, she says, the magic of Yule lies in its duality. While the world outside is dark and cold, the inner spirit is lit with the fire of hope and renewal. Yule teaches us that even in the coldest, darkest times, light and warmth are just around the corner. Here in Tucson, Arizona, it might be a little harder to connect to this idea of that need and desire for warmth, right? You may be watching this and you're not in Tucson, or you might be here specifically to escape the cold somewhere else. But, maybe you even relate. If you're like me, it hits 71 degrees and you're like, time to put on the wool sweater. But the reality is if you don't connect to this idea physically, maybe you will at least be able to connect to it spiritually, right? This idea that we all face cold and dark times personally, collectively, right? And what Yule is inviting us to see is that even before we feel the change in the season, in the circumstance, may we still celebrate the light and the warmth and the hope that is yet to come, trusting in the cycles of nature. See, Yule is grounded in a more cyclical understanding of time. And I think a cyclical understanding of time can in many ways be a salve for us when we face difficulty, both personally and in our world, and we look at situations where we wonder, what is going to happen? How could this, how is this going to turn out? How could this change? And we remember that time is not just a line, but it is also a cycle where things come up over and over again and things resolve over and over again. And so Yule is an invitation to trust in the cycles that our planet has been through and that we've experienced in our own lives, right? Like how many of us can look at our lives and we could say that the light has always returned one way or another. Maybe not in the way that you were expecting, right? Maybe not in the way you would have wanted, but the light always returned. Just as in the wintertime, we know that the sun and the warmth will return to us. We have those images. We hold on to that hope. When I lived in Seattle, where we had 9 months of gray and 2 months of summer, I would reflect, and a friend of mine, we would go out and we would go paddleboarding in the middle of summer. And I remember these moments where we'd be paddleboarding in the middle of a lake. It's a beautiful day. And he would say to me, store this memory because winter is coming. And that's not a Game of Thrones reference, but winter is coming. He said, store up this memory because we're going to need it, right? We're going to need to draw upon this memory in the middle of winter. Maybe sometimes for us here in Tucson, it's the opposite, right? We're in that wonderful golden season of the year. Store these memories, right? When you're feeling a little cold, hold on to that because we know what's coming, right? But the thing about Yule and the invitation about seeing through this lens is that we are not rejecting the dark or the darkness in our lives. We are recognizing that the dark is a part of it. It's a part of the rhythm of life. And we can still stand in the dark while having hope for what's possible and for what's yet to come. At its core, Yule is a day in which to proudly stand within the darkness, knowing in our souls that the light will be triumphant. It's from Sara Rae Hoagland. And so we can see how so much of the holiday traditions that we hold dear, right? So much of the December lights that we connect to are in fact influenced by our human connection to the seasons and to the cycles of this planet. And so last week, we talked about the December lights of the menorah and the kinara of Hanukkah and Kwanzaa. And this week, the specific December light that we are going to hone in on is the Yule log. See, what really is the Yule log? Is it just another log on the fire during Christmas, right? Or is the Yule log a wonderful pastry? Ooh. Oh, my goodness. Whoa. Eesh. Oh, my goodness. Snap out of it. That's not what today's about. Okay. Some of you, how many of you have made something like that? Okay. Can you make me? Okay. I'm very hungry. No, the real heart of the Yule log is that it is the central symbol of this Yule tradition in that it's burning, the burning of the Yule log, it represents that light and that warmth in the darkness. And friends, where in your life have you had something that was a Yule log to you, that in a dark time, in a time of coldness, in a time of shadow, something showed up in your life that offered warmth and light that you clung to? Right? Maybe it was a relationship. Maybe it was a book or a spiritual teaching. Maybe it's a community like this, right? As Jean shared, that a community can be that warmth and that light for you in a difficult moment. And friends, a Yule log does not need to be an actual log. See, I would love to have lit a Yule log here, but I think it would have set off our sprinklers, and I don't think we're ready for that level of a winter experience. But a Yule log can be as something as simple as anything that you can create some ceremony around and burn, or you can take somewhere where you can burn if you can't do it at your house. But it's not about it being exactly like it was for our ancestors, but it's about something that holds meaning to you, something that you can create some ritual and ceremony around. See, Yule invites us to see through the lens of ritual and ceremony. For some of us, the only time that we consciously think about ceremony is something like a wedding ceremony. But the reality is, friends, is that our lives are actually full of ritual and ceremony, whether or not we realize it. Something as simple as how you make your coffee and your tea with intention can be a ritual, right? And so Yule is an invitation to see the holiday traditions through this lens. And as many rituals begin, really we enter into that ceremonial space long before the actual day, but really when our intentions start. And so our ancestors would take the Yule log, and before the solstice, they would decorate this Yule log. And one important aspect of the Yule log is that they would place on the Yule log intentions for the year past and intentions for the year ahead. Literally, it could be pieces of paper that will eventually be burned with the Yule log. And so in thinking about this idea of intentions, it resonates with the idea of New Year's resolutions, right? And in many ways, this is where we get the idea of New Year's resolutions from Yule. And we know, we've talked about this before, that the end of the year is a very potent time to think about what you intend to bring into the new year and what you intend to leave behind. That the end of the year is a threshold. Maybe it is a man-made one, but it is a threshold nonetheless, and there is a power in what we bring to it. And so I thought I'd, just model for you what it might look like to create some intentions by your Yule log. So I'm going to start with the things that I'm going to leave in the past in 2024. Okay, the first thing I'm going to leave in the past in 2024, less trash talk during cribbage. Okay. Second thing I'm going to leave behind in 2024. When I make a reservation at a restaurant and then I'm seated and then someone else comes in and they didn't make a reservation and they don't get seated, I feel better than them. And I'm going to leave that behind in 2024. Last thing I'm going to leave behind in 2024. When my dental hygienist asks me how much I've been flossing and I lie to her. I'm not going to do that anymore. Thank you. All right, things I'm going to take into my intention for 2025 and the year ahead. All right, create a new system for folding my clothes that is more than just throwing it all into the drawer. Okay. Complete a New York Times crossword puzzle Wednesday or later without cheating. Find out. This is the last thing. Find out once and for all, is the phrase for all intents and purposes or for all intensive purposes? Okay. No one knows. But I will find out, and I will report back. Obviously, I'm joking, but in all seriousness, this idea of taking our intentions into a ritual context, into a ceremonial context, and burning them, it holds deep subconscious meaning for us, right? There's a deep level of accountability there. We can all understand how it's more powerful to write our intentions down and gather with people and burn them than it is just to simply walk into the new year saying, I'd like to do this, or I'd like to do that, right? And so what would happen is on the solstice, the log would be lit, and it would be lit with a piece of the previous year's Yule log as a way of representing the cyclical nature of time and the continuity of these traditions. And then a family would sit in front of the Yule log fire, tending to it all night, reflecting about the year past, dreaming for the year ahead, and celebrating together all night. And this image of a family celebrating at the fire, it also, to me, resonates of another European concept, that of hygge, that you may or may not be familiar with. It's spelled Hygge. It's a Norwegian and Danish concept of coziness and togetherness that is nourishing for the soul, right? And so this idea of, staying up all night by the fire, I'm going to take that symbolically because staying up all night sounds horrible. I do never stay up all night. But just taken as a symbol, what does that feel like for you to imagine sitting with the ones you love and the ones you care about, tending to a fire, having quality time of connection, those conversations that come up, right? Maybe think about that image in the weeks ahead as you imagine what you want your holidays to look like. After the fire had been burnt, ashes from the Yule log were placed in the garden, again as a symbol for vitality and hope for the year to come, and an unburnt piece is saved for the year ahead. These are symbols of continuity, that the Yule log remains with us throughout the rest of the year. See, sometimes after the holidays are over, we lose a connection to the feeling that we had, right? the holidays end, and then it's almost as if we never experienced them at all. But what happens is when we place deep intention around certain symbols, certain actions, they stick with us. The feelings, the experiences, the intentions stick with us. Sometimes our holiday traditions, they simply lose meaning over time, right? Every year we put up the tree, we light the fireplace, we eat more cookies in 1 week than we do the rest of the year, but they just become rote traditions. But what I love about this invitation from Yule is to remember that these symbols have deep meaning, that the evergreen represents the promise of renewal. The Yule log represents a hope and a light and a warmth in dark times. So friends, maybe for you, Christmas isn't feeling the same this year as it always has. And yet you're still drawn to celebrate in this time of year. Consider creating a tradition that is uniquely your own, that belongs uniquely to you, your family, your loved ones. And yet you get to draw from so many profound traditions that our ancestors have given us. What's important in approaching this is that the symbols and rituals have meaning to you in the same way that Yule had meaning to those who came before. See, something that I've found to be true in my own spiritual life is that the most important thing is not replicating to a T a tradition that came before. Now, if replicating something exactly is meaningful to you, great. But it also, in many ways, I think we are free to draw from different traditions in ways that create meaning for us. And I encourage you to think about that as you move forward in really building a holiday season that is meaningful to you. So Aldea, may we see our holiday celebrations, our gathering, our joy as part of the larger, grander story of nature. May we remember Yule and remember that even in the coldest and darkest moments of the year, or the coldest and darkest moments of our life, the light will always return. And as we sit by the fire this winter, whether literally or metaphorically, would we be held by a community, by family, and by our ancestors as we look to the year ahead.